today, finishing up Imperfect competition, talking about the other two types of imperfectly competitive markets, which would be oligopolies and monopolistically competitive markets. But as a kind of a quick recap and maybe a summary of monopolies versus perfectly competitive. So when we look at our line graph, right, our line graph of least competitive to most competitive, we see the monopolies are the least competitive by far, and perfectly competitive are the most competitive, right? And so if we recall the things that really determine this are market power, right, or are determined by this, right? So market power, right, is kind of the thing that determines how competitive you are, and the things that determine market power are things like barriers to entry and the ability to differentiate your goods. Right. So these three things combined, right, kind of determine the market type, and the higher the market power, the higher the power, the higher the price of the good being sold, as well as the lower the quantity is being sold. Right. So I'm bringing this up now to relate it to our next two markets as well, because we're going to see this same kind of idea play out amongst these two. And the first one we're going to talk about, we're not going to go into the curves that we did last time, because it's not necessary. It honestly, it'd probably just muddle things up. But the next is oligopoly. Okay, so what an oligopoly is pretty simple, right? Oligopoly is a market with a few sellers in the market, as opposed to one or so many that there's no market power, right? So they talk about some examples here. They talk about tennis balls, they talk about aircraft, they talk about light bulbs, washing machines, and cigarettes. They talk about breakfast cereals as well, but they also brought that up in monopolistically competitive. Breakfast cereals are interesting because there's a few major producers of breakfast cereals, but they all produce different brands within that company, right? So whether breakfast cereals are oligopolies or monopolistically competitive is probably depends upon how you look at the market. If you look at, maybe sugar cereals, it's monopolistically competitive, right? Because there's tons of different sugar cereal types. But if you look at the entire cereal market as a whole, it's probably an oligopoly, because there are only few companies that make cereals, right? I don't know them because I don't really eat cereal all that much anymore. But yes, so. And anyways, they talk about oligopolies being much harder to analyze, which is true, but luckily for us, they do not make us go into those details. So a few key things about an oligopoly, right? So just like a monopoly, they do face a downward sloping demand curve, right? If you recall, perfectly competitive markets do not, right? They face a horizontal demand curve, because again, they cannot go above or below the price that it's at. Okay. Which means that their marginal revenue is stagnant, right? It is the same. But here we also have a marginal revenue that is lower than the demand curve. And because of this, right, because of this downward sloping demand curve and marginal revenue being lower than demand, right, that leads to a situation where we have higher prices and a lower quantity sold than a perfectly competitive market. Right. If I actually just pull back up the Monopoly, cancel. Well, I can't do that. Let's go save as, say this is Oligopoly, and then we'll open up our Monopoly one just quickly. Right. So again, if we looked at this, if we're back on this curve, right, we saw that since monopoly demand is downward sloping, right, the marginal revenue is downward sloping. And marginal revenue, again, is downward sloping at a faster rate, because the idea that if you're going to sell at a lower price, right, that means that each unit is sold at a lower price, which means your marginal revenue per unit is lower, right? As an example, right, let's say, we could be selling here at, let's just say $10 just to, make it easy, right? And so you're making $10 per unit, right? Well, if you decrease if you decrease the price but increase the quantity, right, maybe you're only selling at $9, so that means the marginal revenue, right, is going to be $1 less per unit, which actually, mathematically changes into a whole different situation, right? So because of that, right, it's not just this downward sloping demand curve, right? It is this downward sloping marginal revenue that's at a quicker angle, right? Hopefully that wasn't too confusing. I feel like it might have been, and that's okay. We'll probably have some time to kind of get together and figure that out a little bit better, right? So we have a downward sloping demand curve, which means we have marginal revenue lower than demand, which means we have a higher price and lower quantity than a perfectly competitive market, right? The interesting thing about oligopolies is that even though they have this downward sloping demand curve that monopolies do, they also have to base their choices, their strategy, based on what the other suppliers do, right? So the decisions of a firm in an oligopoly are going to be heavily based on what other firms do, right? Because each firm has a lot of market power, right? And so you don't want to be kind of left in the lurch if all the other firms decide to do something, right? So, for example, let's say that there are 4 firms and 3 of the firms decide to increase prices, or to increase quantity to decrease prices. Well, all of a sudden, you as the other firm, if you don't increase your quantity as well, then you're going to be making less per each unit, right? You might get pushed out of the market, okay? So because of this, though, because of this idea that they have to know what the others are doing, this also leads to a situation where there can be strategic interaction between these companies, right? And that strategic action can essentially, if these firms cooperate, right? If these firms cooperate, they can essentially act like a monopoly, right? Where they get the highest possible profit possible, right? Where they're restricting the quantity they're restricting the quantity to where for everybody marginal revenue equals marginal cost, right? They're profit maximizing, right? But if they're not interacting in this way, if they're not working together, then that's not going to happen, right? Okay, so this idea, right, firms cooperating, is a cartel. Right, a cartel is when oligopoly firms cooperate to act like a monopoly. Right, which is, as you probably know, at least in the United States, in most countries, illegal. Right. So this is illegal under the Sherman and Clayton antitrust laws. Right. If you recall, the Sherman Antitrust Act is 1896, 1894, one of those days. 1890, sorry. Sherman Antitrust Act in 1890. Right. So this is illegal under U.S. antitrust law. Okay. That doesn't mean that doesn't happen, right? But on top of this, so a cartel is literally when they get together and discuss and figure out exactly how much they each want to produce, right? But the problem with the cartel is not just that it's illegal, right? This can also be easily undermined by the companies within the cartel, right? So, for example, let's say that let's provide an example out here. I'm gonna put it in a different color. I thought I was gonna put a different color. There we go. All right. Example. So there's 4 firms, and let's say all 4 firms agree to lower quantities, lower quantity produced, which of course will lead to an increased price of the good. Okay. So all 4 firms agree to do this, but what happens instead is one firm increases their quantity, or let's not say increase, keeps the same quantity produced, right? Well, what happens is, since they're only theoretically 25% of the market, the price is still going to increase, right? But it's not going to increase as much as the other three firms hoped, right? And so we see a small increase in price, right, which leads to a massive revenue gain for that one firm, whereas the other three firms may not see that same gain because of diminishing returns to scale, right? If they scaled up, since I got that backwards. Since they lowered their quantity, right? They lowered their quantity by an amount they thought would make more money based on the new price, but since the new price is lower than they expected, right, that they're going to make less money than anticipated, right? And so as soon as this happens, it basically breaks the whole cartel, right? And so it's a lot of it's a lot of like game theory, right, kind of stuff that could happen here, which we don't need to know about game theory for this economics, but game theory is fascinating. If you've heard of things like the prisoner's dilemma and stuff like that, that would be game theory. So because of that, right, these cartels are very tough to make work, right? And so let's talk about a real life example, right? A real life cartel that is legal, and that is OPEC, the Organization of Petroleum Exporting Countries, which mostly includes countries in the Middle East as well as some countries in Africa and I believe Venezuela, right? So it is an international agreement, right? It's an international organization essentially. So it's not only an international organization; it's an international organization of governments, right? These governments are collaborating together on OPEC, right? And so they try to coordinate production and raise prices. That's their kind of goal. Their goal is to decrease the quantity they produce in order to make more revenue from each unit produced, right? And in real life, something happened here, right? In the 1970s, right? OPEC kind of created an oil crisis, right? They raised prices. They helped raise prices on a barrel of oil from. We're going to actually use our red numbers here. These are probably ones you need to memorize. From $11 in 1972. To $35 a barrel in 1981. Right, so over the course of 9 years, they tripled the price of a barrel of oil, right? And so that led to a massive economic downturn, right? That led to a massive economic downturn in non-OPEC countries, right? In non-oil producing countries. Which at this time, the United States would be included in that. The United States did produce oil, but not to the extent that OPEC or other countries like Russia maybe did at the time. Now we do. Right now, we are one of the world's largest producers of oil. But back in the day, that was not the case. However, we see the error over here come into play, right? What we start to see is at this high price, at $35, right? OPEC countries began raising production to capture more profit, and what that led to is pretty quickly a situation where the price was back down to $13 a barrel in 1986, which, looking at this price to this price, is probably close to the rate of inflation, right? So it's almost back to normal, right? So because of this, right, in the end, what we kind of see then is, as we can kind of see down here, right, we have over here on Monopoly, we have the highest price and the lowest quantity of any of these markets, right? And over here, we have the lowest price and the highest quantity in any of these markets. So oligopoly falls somewhere in the middle, right? And a little bit closer to monopoly of having high prices and low quantities, but not as high of price or as low a quantity here, right? And again, that is because of their ability to control the market. And so social welfare, right? Social welfare effects, which I don't know if I made this clear enough. Social welfare, I'm actually going to put this as kind of like a key thing. I don't know what color, it's not a term or anything. Let's go green. Social welfare in our kind of calculus of it is equal to total surplus. Okay, so that total surplus that we've been looking at on the curves is essentially social welfare by their terms, right? And so oligopolies do lower social welfare from the kind of height of perfectly competitive markets, right? But not as low as monopolies, and we really can't say where it is. We probably say it is closer to monopolies, but it's too many factors to really like make up a clear case onto what the case would be, right? So oligopoly and a little social welfare, then a perfectly competitive market. Okay, so there is that. Let me erase this just so I have some more space over here to talk about monopolistically competitive firms. All right. All right. So let's move over here for monopolistically competitive firms. This is probably the hardest one to understand. A monopolistically competitive market. Also, let me do this over here. Okay. So also known as monopolistic competition, right? Monopolistically competitive firms are interesting, and to kind of, so here's the two key things I guess I want to say about that define a monopolistically competitive market. You do have differentiated products, right? So you do have differentiated products, like, for example, a monopoly, or not for example, but like a monopoly. The other aspect of this, though, is that there are no barriers to entry. Okay, there are no barriers to entry like a perfectly competitive market, right? So that is how it combines the two things, right? So an example that they use is book publishing, right? So it's very easy to publish a book, right? You can self-publish a book, you can write and self-publish a book, right? And so, you are in a perfectly competitive market of books. However, at the same time, they're also different, right? Every book is unique, right? And so because of this, you are able to differentiate your product at some ways, right? George R.R. Martin was able to differentiate his products by being a really good writer, right? Or at least a writer people like, right? Whether you think it's a good writer or not, that's up to you, right? So that's why monopolistic competitive firms are so unique, is that because it shares traits of both the least competitive but also the most competitive types of markets, right? So because we have a differentiated product, right? Since we have a differentiated product, that leads to the idea that we have a downward sloping demand curve. Downward sloping demand curve, which of course means a downward sloping marginal revenue curve as well. So because of that, as we've seen, that means that firms can choose how much they produce. Okay, so at this point, we also see a situation where we're going to have less social welfare than we saw in the monopolistically competitive market, right? And so we're going to see a situation where they're not producing at that market equilibrium that we saw in the perfectly competitive market, right? So firms can choose how much they produce, right? However, at the same time, since we have no barriers to entry, right? If there is positive economic profit, if there's positive economic profit in the market, right? Which, again, if you don't remember this is accounting profit plus covering your opportunity costs, right? Your opportunity cost here being the alternative of what other job you would have, right, or what other business you would be in. Since there's no barriers to entry, you will see entry into the market. Okay. And that entry into the market does the kind of opposite that we talked about here with the differentiated situation, right? So we will see, because of this, right, we will see profits fall, profits decrease due to these no barriers to entry, right? And barriers and entry will continue. Entry continues until economic profits equal zero. Right, because again, since it is a no barriers to entry type of market, right, you're going to see every firm possible try to capture those economic profits, right? And then if they do fall below zero, right, you will see exit until it goes back up to zero, right? So monopolistic competitive firms, again, it's very unique. I don't know if I'm doing a perfectly good explanation of it, to be honest, right? But what you do see is that, these products are different enough to kind of separate themselves from within the market, right? So if you're looking at a monopolistic competitive market, right, if you assumed that all if you assumed all cereal brands were different companies, right? If you assumed, the company who owns Golden Grahams is an independent company, Captain Crunch is an independent company. What you would see then is that each of these brands are trying to differentiate themselves from the other brands, right? By coming up with different things that people like, so let's see. I'm trying to find some good examples. Okay, restaurants. Restaurants are monopolistically competitive, definitely, right? There are tons of restaurants, right? You can go to literally any restaurant and get what you want, which is food. But what each firm can do is kind of differentiate themselves through the food they offer, through the service they offer, right? Those kind of things. Hotels, right, are monopolistically competitive. If you're going to a place with a hotel, there are going to be tons of hotels you can go to, but the question is what kind of services and amenities you want, right? Hairdressers, right? Other examples of monopolistically competitive firms. Okay, so hopefully those examples might help a little bit, right? Okay, so those are our four. Examples of perfect or of competitive markets or imperfect markets as well. Monopolistic competition. Okay, so what you're again going to see here is like basically not only are we're almost seeing two other parallel lines here, right? Where the highest prices and lowest quantity over here, lowest prices and the highest quantity over here, right? So monopolistic competitive probably has lower prices and higher quantities than oligopoly, but not perfect competition, right? Okay. So last thing I want to talk about in this section is the concept of creative destruction. So creative destruction is a pretty interesting thing, right? So the thing here that we wanted that they start talking about is economic profits, right? And so what we see is the presence of economic profits drives people to a market, right? Economic. Come on. Economic profits pushes people to a market, pushes firms to a market, let's say. Right. So economic profits push firms to a market, right? But because of this, also, what we then see is that we have self-interested people, firms, or individuals who want to create new ways to find economic profits, right? So people try to find new ways to create economic profits. Right, because if you can be the first one to notice, to exploit a new market, right, you are going to make pretty miraculous economic profits, right? And what did we kind of show as the easiest way to create economic profits, right? Or one of the easiest ways to create economic profit is to, I'm going to shorten this down to economic profit. I'm going to go over here real quick and create a new thing here. Profit equals pi. Typically speaking, in economic stuff, profit will equal pi. Right. So the easiest way to create economic profit is to create barriers to entry. Right. As we saw with monopolistic competitive and perfectly competitive firms, right, you will see a point where because they don't have barriers to entry, people will enter the market until the economic profit is zero. But what if you can create barriers to entry, right? And so, we saw that with oligopolies and monopolies, right? They have barriers to entry and stuff like that. And so the easiest way, and kind of a way this idea of these markets doesn't necessarily highlight, one of the easiest ways to create barriers to entry is to innovate. So you can create your own barriers to entry by innovation, right? By creating new markets, right? By creating new ideas, right? And those, of course, are created by entrepreneurs. So entrepreneurs I like to use I want to use the formal USAC kind of definition. Take on risk to create new products and services. Right, services are things that people do for you, right? Like an Uber kind of thing, right? They create new products or services, or they create new markets, right? Or they develop new methods of production, right? Which can find them an inefficiency in a market that they can exploit, right? So the reward for being an entrepreneur is those economic profits that we've talked about, right? If you're the first to a new market, right, you are going to get, you're going to recoup a lot of the economic profits before anybody else can get in, right? So if you're the first to the market, right, you recoup most of the economic profit. And in the case of, inventing something, right, creating literally something new, right, if it's a kind of scientific innovation, right, or invention, right, the government creates economic profit for you because you get a patent, right? You get to patent that good for usually like 20 years, I believe is what it said. Right. So for 20 years, you're the only person in that market, right? That is a government monopoly. And so you are a government created monopoly. So you are able to just reap all the rewards of that potential market. Right. So that's not necessarily what happens, though, all the time, right? Let's say you're already in a current market, right? If you're already in an existing market, right, you're not necessarily going to be able to invent a whole new market, right? But what you can do is you can innovate an ability to differentiate your good, which allows you to that allows you to kind of recoup more profit, economic profit from that market, right? So you can differentiate your goods and create more power in the market. And when you have that more market power, you get an increase in economic profit as well. Okay. So entrepreneurship can create new barriers to entry, right, which allows for them to recoup new economic profits, right? However, entrepreneurship and innovation also can do the opposite of this, right? Right? Innovation can also tear down barriers to entry. Right, which allows those people who break down those barriers as kind of the first people to do so to reward themselves with economic profits as well, right? They might not be it's kind of the same thing here, right? They're not the first in, but since they're the second in, right, they're allowed to kind of exploit the situation for more economic profits, right? So the existence of barriers to entry, right? The existence of barriers to entry encourages people. Well, not barriers to entry, right? But because of barriers to entry, right, we have economic profits, right? So the economic profits in a market with barriers to entry encourages people to innovate around these barriers. Okay. So that allows them to make to enter that market and make a lot of money off of this kind of as the first in with this new system. Again, they're not necessarily the first into this market. They might not be the second in, but they are one of the first to be able to break in through these barriers to entry, right? And so some examples they talked about are satellite television, which competed with cable television, and now, right, you're looking at like streaming services, right? I think streaming services is kind of a pretty good example of that in this day and age, right? Netflix was first to the table to become a really serious streaming service. Hulu was as well, but especially Netflix. And now look at what they're able to do, right? They're able to turn that ability to break down that barrier to entry for people into massive, massive profits, right? An economic profit, right? They also talked about different mobile phone manufacturers, right? Like Samsung, like Google, who are able to imitate the Apple iPhone and differentiate their products in different ways, right? So, this continuing innovation, right? These continuing innovations that are meant to break down barriers or create barriers, right? This innovation is key to long-term economic growth, right? Long-term economic growth, and maybe another thing we'll talk about later, average labor productivity, right? And this whole concept is really summed up nicely by one man who you need to know. So I'm going to put his name in red. Joseph Schumpeter, or Schumpeter. I do not know how to say his name, right? Who called this, right, this idea of economists, or excuse me, of entrepreneurs destroying barriers to entry or creating new barriers to entry. He called it creative destruction, right? Essentially exposing inefficiencies that were not there before, right? And the essential catalyst to creating creative destruction is the search for economic profits. Right? Again, not accounting profits, economic profits. Right? So what we see and what the argument here is that the inefficiencies, and this is what Schumpeter is arguing, the inefficiencies of a market with economic profits, right, which, as we've seen, right, those are, you're losing out on social welfare in these markets. Excuse me, I got that in my head. The inefficiencies of a market with economic profit are not nearly as great, are less than the benefits of these innovations, right? Right. So, with Netflix, right, because they were one of the first to the market, they were able to charge a much higher price per month for their service than other people, However, I think a lot of people would argue that in the long run, that's better and much better than paying for a cable bill or paying for satellite television, right? So that's creative destruction. And then that is also oligopolies and monopolistically competitive markets. Please leave questions in the comments if you have any on this one. I think this was a little tough to kind of get through and understand. Hopefully I helped out. If I didn't, we can go over this again. That's not an issue. But coming up after this is probably one of the tougher sections. I think there's a few tough sections of micro. I think elasticity is tough. I think understanding there's some monopolies and perfectly competitive firms is tough. And I think market failures is really tough, and especially tough because, frankly, I don't think the way they explained it is very good. But that's for tomorrow, for the next video, and I'll see you then.